On August 26, 1346, a rain-soaked field near the village of Crécy became the grave of an age. The English army was exhausted. Their boots were heavy with mud. Their supplies were thin. Their men had been marching, raiding, burning, and retreating through northern France for weeks. They were far from home, deep in enemy territory, and outnumbered by one of the greatest armies Europe could gather. Across the field, the French appeared almost unstoppable. 30,000 men, thousands of armored knights, princes, dukes, counts, and lords riding beneath banners, bright enough to make the battlefield look like a tournament ground. Their warhorses were massive, their armor was expensive, their confidence was absolute. To them, the English looked trapped, a tired army on a hill, a king with nowhere to run, a few thousand archers in wool and leather, standing beside sharpened stakes with plain wooden bows in their hands. The French nobility had no reason to fear such men. For centuries, the mounted knight had dominated European warfare. He was the battlefield's master, armored, trained from childhood, raised in a culture that told him courage, bloodline, and the charge of heavy cavalry could decide the fate of kingdoms. Infantry could be scattered. Peasants could be crushed. Archers were irritants. The real war belonged to noblemen on horseback. But 4 hours later, the field told a different story. The French charges had failed again and again. The Genoese crossbowmen had been broken. The knights had ridden into mud, arrows, confusion, and their own pride. Some of the highest-born men in Europe lay defeated on the slope they believed they would conquer before sunset. The English lost very few men. The French lost the flower of their aristocracy. And in one afternoon, the old belief that noble blood ruled the battlefield was shattered by common archers wielding wood, string, discipline, and distance. This was not only a battle, it was a funeral for medieval chivalry. If you are drawn to the darker corners of history, subscribe to Grimmer History and help us reach 45,000 subscribers. Every story here is built to uncover the past with atmosphere, tension, and respect for the lives history tried to bury. Today, we step onto the slope at Crécy, not to celebrate slaughter, but to understand how a few thousand archers changed the future of war. The road to Crécy began with a king's ambition and a kingdom's weakness. Edward III of England had landed in Normandy in 1346 with an army built not only for conquest, but for devastation. He claimed the French throne through his mother's line, and that claim would become one of the sparks of the 100 Years' War. But Edward's campaign in northern France was not a clean march toward a single battlefield. It was a chevauchée, a campaign of destruction. Villages were burned, storehouses were emptied, crops were ruined, wealth was seized. The purpose was not only to feed the English army or punish the French countryside, it was psychological warfare. Edward wanted to show that the French king could not protect his own land. That was the insult behind the flames. Every ruined field asked the same question: where is the King of France? Philip VI of France could not ignore it. He gathered an enormous army and moved to trap Edward before the English could escape to safety. The French host was not merely large, it was prestigious. Noble families, allied princes, experienced knights, and foreign contingents gathered under the French banner. To medieval eyes, this was power made visible. Armored men, warhorses, lances, banners, trumpets, servants, heralds, high-born warriors who believed themselves chosen by birth and training to rule the battlefield. The French knight was not just a soldier, he was a social order in armor. His equipment cost more than many villages could imagine. His horse had been bred for war. His body had been trained since youth. His entire culture told him that combat proved nobility, and nobility proved superiority. Edward understood that culture, and he planned against it. By the time the English reached the high ground near Crécy, Edward chose not to keep running. He stopped. He arranged his men. He forced the French to come to him. The position mattered. The English stood on rising ground. Their line was arranged defensively. The archers were placed where their arrows could overlap, creating deadly fields of fire. Obstacles were prepared. Pits and rough ground would disrupt cavalry. Stakes and terrain would weaken the force of the charge. Then, Edward made a decision that seemed shocking to the medieval mind. He ordered his knights to dismount. English nobles, men who had been raised to fight from horseback, would stand on foot beside common archers and men-at-arms. It was a humiliation to pride, but it was a victory for tactics. Edward knew what Philip's nobles refused to accept. A cavalry charge was powerful only when it had momentum, space, discipline, and timing. Force the knights uphill, break their formation, drain their horses, strike them before they reach the line, turn the terrain against them. Then the knight, that symbol of 500 years of battlefield dominance, became vulnerable. The English longbowmen were the key. They were not noble. Many were common men, some from Wales, others from England's villages and towns. Their weapon looked simple, a long stave of yew, taller than many men, with a string and arrows that could be made in numbers. But simplicity was deceptive. The longbow required years of training. English law encouraged and often required archery practice because kings understood the value of a population skilled with the bow. A strong archer could shoot rapidly and repeatedly, in a way few crossbowmen could match. The weapon demanded strength, discipline, and endurance. The skeletons of longbowmen found by archaeologists show the cost of that training. Altered shoulders, strained arms, bodies shaped by years of drawing heavy bows. These were not untrained peasants with sticks. They were specialists born from law, habit, and necessity. The French looked at them and saw low-born men. Edward looked at them and saw the future. That night, the English prepared with quiet discipline. Bowstrings were protected from moisture. Arrows were placed within reach. Men ate what they could. The hill was made ready. The army settled into its position and waited. Across the distance, the French came with numbers, prestige, and anger. They had marched hard. They were tired. But when they saw the English waiting, many French nobles believed victory was within reach. They did not want delay. They did not want caution. They did not want to let another lord take the honor of striking first. Philip VI reportedly wanted to halt and attack in better order the next day. His nobles did not wait. That was where the disaster began. The weather turned before the battle did. A storm passed over the field. Rain fell hard enough to soak men, horses, earth, and bowstrings. To the French knights in armor, the rain seemed inconvenient but not decisive. They trusted steel, weight, and numbers. A little weather would not stop noble cavalry, but to missile troops, rain mattered. The English archers protected their bowstrings, unstringing their bows and keeping the cords dry beneath helmets, cloaks, or clothing. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired by the French, did not have the same advantage. Their strings were exposed to the storm. Their large protective shields, called pavises, were reportedly still with the baggage and not properly available when they were ordered forward. They were exhausted, they were wet, they were unprotected, and they were sent first. The Genoese crossbowmen were not cowards. They were professional soldiers, some of the finest missile troops in Europe, but they had been placed in a terrible position. Their weapons were slower to reload than longbows. Their strings had been weakened by rain. They lacked the shields that usually protected them while reloading. They advanced toward the English line and loosed their first volleys. Many shots fell short or failed to do real damage. Then the English longbows answered. Thousands of bows bent together. Thousands of strings snapped forward. The sound, according to later imagination, was like a storm tearing open above the field. The arrows came rapidly, not as single shots, but as a moving weather of war. The Genoese had no proper cover. Their crossbows could not match the speed of the longbows. They began to fall back. And then the French did something that revealed the arrogance tearing their own army apart. Seeing the Genoese retreat, some French knights treated them not as allies caught in impossible conditions, but as obstacles. They pushed through them. Some sources describe French nobles turning violently on the crossbowmen for blocking the advance. Whatever the exact details, the result was chaos. The French vanguard disrupted its own line before fully reaching the English. The first wave had not weakened Edward, it had weakened Philip. Then the heavy cavalry charged. This was the moment French chivalry trusted most. The lowering of lances, the thunder of hooves, the iron mass of armored men and horses moving together. For centuries, such a sight could decide battles before the lines even met. But Crécy was not a tournament field. It was a trap. The French charged uphill through mud, over broken ground, past fleeing men, toward an enemy that had no intention of meeting them in the old way. English arrows struck from the front and sides. The horses suffered terribly under the storm. A knight's armor might deflect many missiles at distance, but horses had vulnerable places. When horses stumbled, reared, or fell, the formation behind them broke. A cavalry charge depends on motion. At Crécy, motion became confusion. Fallen horses blocked the advance. Riders crashed into one another. Mud slowed everything. Men struggled under the weight of armor. Those behind pressed forward, unable to see clearly what had happened in front. The longbowmen kept shooting. That was the discipline that made them terrifying. Not one heroic shot, not one dramatic duel. Repetition, rhythm, training. Thousands of men doing the same thing again and again, while the enemy's pride carried him into range. The French charged again, and again, and again. Each wave believed it might succeed where the last had failed. Each wave found the same slope, the same arrows, the same obstacles, the same English line holding firm. The battle became not a clash of equal systems, but a collision between an old idea and a new reality. The old idea said nobility, armor, courage, and the mounted charge could break any enemy. The new reality said position, discipline, missile fire, and prepared defenses could destroy even the proudest cavalry in Europe. And the French had arrived too confident to learn in time. In the middle of this disaster, one figure became legend. King John of Bohemia was old by battlefield standards and blind. He had been unable to see for years, but he had come to fight alongside the French, and when he realized the battle was turning against them, he refused to leave. The story, preserved in later tradition, says that he asked his knights to guide him into the fight. They tied their horses together so that they could ride as one group, leading their blind king toward the sound of battle. There is something terrible and noble in that image. A blind king riding toward a field he could not see. A man choosing honor over survival. A final charge into a war that had already changed beyond the values he represented. John of Bohemia belonged to the old world of chivalric courage. He believed a king should not flee while others fought. He believed there was dignity in striking one blow before death. He believed honor could still be found in the charge. At Crécy, that belief met the longbow. John and his companions did not return. When their bodies were later found, the story of the tied horses became a symbol of doomed bravery. Edward, Prince of Wales, later known as the Black Prince, was said to have been moved by John's courage and adopted his emblem of 3 ostrich feathers and the motto associated with him. The legend survived because it captured the spirit of the day. Crécy did not merely kill men, it killed an ideal. The French continued to attack as daylight faded. Philip VI himself was wounded and forced from the field. The sacred French battle banner, the oriflamme, which carried deep symbolic power, did not deliver the victory many had expected. As night came down, the battlefield belonged to the English. The scale of French losses shocked Europe. Ancient and medieval sources vary in exact numbers, but the meaning was clear. The French aristocracy had suffered a catastrophe. Counts, lords, knights, and high-born warriors who expected glory had been destroyed by an army that relied heavily on common archers and defensive tactics. The English losses were far smaller. The contrast became almost unbelievable. But the numbers, however debated, matter less than the social shock. Medieval warfare often treated noble prisoners as valuable. A captured lord could be ransomed. His life had monetary and political worth. War among elites had rules, expectations, and profit built into it. But arrows did not respect lineage. A longbowman did not need to know whether the man beneath the visor was a count, a duke, or a prince. He only needed to shoot. That was the humiliation. A nobleman who had spent a lifetime believing his blood placed him above ordinary men could fall to a weapon held by someone he would not have considered his equal. Crécy revealed a brutal truth. On the battlefield, technology and discipline could matter more than birth. A common archer, trained from youth and placed in the right position, could undo the charge of a noble cavalryman whose armor cost more than most families would ever see. The social meaning of this was enormous. If peasants and common soldiers could bring down knights, then the old military hierarchy was not natural law. It was vulnerable. It depended on conditions. It depended on assumptions. And at Crécy, those assumptions were exposed. France did not immediately learn the lesson. Years later, at Poitiers, similar mistakes would lead to another disaster. Later still, at Agincourt, the English longbow and defensive position would again ruin French cavalry confidence. But Crécy was the first great warning. The age of the knight was not over in a single day, but its certainty was broken. From that point forward, European war would increasingly belong not to personal courage alone, but to systems, formations, missile weapons, discipline, logistics, terrain, preparation, and eventually gunpowder. The battlefield was becoming less romantic and far more modern. The aftermath of Crécy was as important as the battle itself. France had not merely lost soldiers, it had lost leadership. Noble families were shaken, provinces mourned lords, alliances were damaged. The prestige of French arms suffered a wound that could not easily be hidden. The English continued toward Calais, which would become one of the great prizes of the campaign. Edward's victory at Crécy gave him the confidence and security to press forward. The war would not end quickly. The 100 Years' War would stretch across generations, reshaping England, France, military practice, royal power, and national identity. But the field near Crécy remained a symbol, a muddy slope where the old world had been forced to look at the future. The French army had possessed numbers, nobility, courage, and wealth. The English had possessed position, discipline, preparation, and archers. The old world believed courage could overcome conditions. The new war proved conditions could destroy courage. This does not mean the French knights were cowards. Many were brave to the point of ruin. They charged repeatedly into danger, knowing after the first waves that the field was deadly. Their failure was not lack of courage, it was lack of adaptation. They fought the battle they wanted, instead of the battle they were actually in. That is one of the oldest causes of disaster in war. Pride turns experience into blindness. Tradition becomes a trap. The French nobles saw a slope and believed they were looking at a stage for glory. Edward saw a killing ground. That difference decided the day. The longbow has sometimes been surrounded by myth, as if it were a magical weapon that could single-handedly end any army. The truth is more disciplined than that. The longbow was devastating because it existed inside a system. Archers were trained for years. Their placement was planned. The ground was chosen. The enemy was forced to attack uphill. The English men-at-arms stood firm. The army worked as one formation. The weapon mattered, but the system mattered more. Crécy was not won by arrows alone. It was won by patience, terrain, coordination, preparation, and the willingness of English nobles to fight on foot beside common men. That last detail may be the most revealing. Edward's army bent social pride to military necessity. Philip's army allowed social pride to overrule command. One side adapted, the other performed tradition until tradition killed it. That is why Crécy belongs in the darker corners of history. It was not just a story of battlefield violence. It was a story of a society discovering, too late, that its highest beliefs could be defeated by practical men with cheaper weapons. A knight could spend a lifetime learning the charge. An archer could spend a lifetime learning the bow. At Crécy, one form of training met another, and the world discovered which one better suited the future. Today, the field of Crécy is quiet. No thunder of hooves, no shouted challenges, no banners whipping above armored lords, no line of English archers waiting beneath a darkening sky. Only earth, roads, a monument, a name remembered by those who know what happened there. But on August 26, 1346, that field became one of the turning points of medieval war. The French had brought the flower of their nobility. The English had brought archers, discipline, and a king willing to break the old rules to survive. By sunset, Europe had seen the future. It was not noble. It was not romantic. It did not care about bloodline. It did not ask whether a man was born to rule. It came in volleys, in mud, in preparation, in men standing together and repeating a practiced motion until the most honored warriors in Christendom could not advance. That is why Crécy still matters. It reminds us that history does not always change through grand speeches or royal decrees. Sometimes it changes when an old class discovers that the world no longer obeys its assumptions. The French knights rode into battle believing the past would protect them. The English archers stood on the hill, knowing the future was already in their hands. And between them, in the rain and mud of northern France, medieval warfare crossed a line it could never fully cross back from. The Battle of Crécy was not the end of knights, but it was the end of their unquestioned supremacy. It proved that courage could be wasted by arrogance, that armor could be defeated by distance, that noble birth could fall before common discipline, and that the battlefield does not honor tradition simply because men are willing to die for it. The mud remembered what pride refused to learn. The age of the knight did not vanish in a single afternoon, but at Crécy it began to die, not beneath a king's sword, not beneath a prince's banner, but under the storm of arrows, loosed by men the nobles had been taught to despise.